The rain had been falling for hours. It drummed against the train windows with a persistence that made me grateful to be inside, warm and dry, watching the dark countryside blur past in streaks of shadow and occasional light. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks had become a kind of meditation, punctuated only by the distant rumble of thunder that seemed to follow us through the night. I'd chosen this late train deliberately. The 11:47 to Edinburgh was never crowded, mostly shift workers heading home, the occasional student, maybe a businessman who'd missed an earlier connection. Tonight, the carriage was nearly empty. Just me, my leather messenger bag, and a paperback I'd been pretending to read for the past hour while my mind wandered to what waited for me at the other end of this journey. My sister's wedding. 3 days of forced smiles, relatives asking why I was still single at 32, and the inevitable conversation with my parents about my lifestyle choices. I'd been putting off this trip for weeks, finding excuses to delay, to avoid. But Emma had called last Sunday with that particular tone she used when she was trying not to cry. "You're my brother, Marcus. I need you there." So here I was, fleeing London at nearly midnight on a Thursday, because facing a train full of strangers felt easier than facing another sleepless night in my flat. Surrounded by wedding planning magazines Emma had thrust upon me, and the growing certainty that I was a coward. The train swayed gently as we took a curve, and I let my head rest against the cool window. The glass fogged slightly with my breath, creating a small patch of opacity in an otherwise clear view of the storm outside. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating sheets of rain that fell like silver curtains across dark fields I couldn't name. That's when I noticed him. He sat maybe 15 rows ahead of me, on the opposite side of the aisle, positioned so that when I looked up from my book, I could see his profile. Dark hair, slightly damp from the rain. He must have boarded at the last stop, though I hadn't noticed him get on. He was staring out his own window, completely still except for his hands, which moved restlessly in his lap, fidgeting as if he was nervous about something. I found myself watching him instead of reading. There was something about the way he held himself, upright but tense, like he was ready to bolt at any moment. His jacket was wet along the shoulders, and I could see droplets of water still clinging to the dark strands of his hair that caught the carriage's fluorescent light. He was beautiful in that understated way that makes you look twice without knowing why. Sharp jawline, long fingers that drummed silently against his thigh, shoulders that suggested he spent time outdoors rather than hunched over a desk like I did. When he shifted slightly, turning toward the aisle, I caught a glimpse of his face in the window's reflection. Serious, dark eyes, the kind of mouth that looked like it didn't smile easily. I forced myself to look back at my book, suddenly aware that I'd been staring. The last thing I needed was to make some stranger uncomfortable on an already unsettling night. But the words on the page seemed to rearrange themselves meaninglessly, and I found my gaze drifting back to him despite my better judgment. The train began to slow. At first, I thought we were approaching another station, though I couldn't remember one being scheduled for another hour. The rhythm of the wheels changed, became more labored, and the carriage swayed differently as we decelerated. But there were no platform lights visible through the rain-streaked windows, no signs of civilization at all. Just darkness, and the sound of the storm growing louder as our mechanical noise diminished. We came to a complete stop with a shudder that ran through the entire carriage. The silence that followed felt enormous. Without the constant clatter of the wheels, I could hear everything else with startling clarity. The rain hammering the roof, the wind pushing against the sides of the train, my own breathing that seemed suddenly too loud in the quiet space. I looked around, expecting to see other passengers stirring, maybe someone checking their phone or moving toward a conductor for information. But the carriage was empty except for me and the stranger who had turned in his seat and was now looking directly at me for the first time. Our eyes met across the empty rows between us. His were darker than I'd expected, almost black in the harsh fluorescent lighting. There was something guarded in his expression, but also curious. He raised his eyebrows slightly, a wordless question that seemed to ask, "Do you know what's happening?" I shook my head, spreading my hands in a gesture of equal confusion. The lights flickered. Once, twice, then went out completely, plunging us into absolute darkness. The silence stretched between us, heavy and strange. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the windows, but inside, it felt like the world had simply stopped. I couldn't see my own hands, couldn't make out the shape of the seats or the aisle. It was the kind of darkness that makes you question whether you still exist. Then his voice cut through the black space between us, low and steady with just a hint of dark humor. Guess we're stuck. I laughed, surprising myself. It wasn't particularly funny, but something about the calm way he'd stated the obvious struck me as absurd. Here we were, two strangers trapped in a powerless train in the middle of nowhere during a storm that sounded like it wanted to tear the roof off, and his response was deadpan acceptance. That's one way to put it, I called back, my voice echoing strangely in the darkness. I heard him shift in his seat, the leather creaking softly. I'm assuming this wasn't on the schedule. Definitely not in the fine print. I fumbled for my phone, its screen providing a small circle of blue-white light that illuminated exactly nothing useful. No signal, of course. You? Nothing. We might as well be on the moon. The light from my phone died as the screen timed out, leaving us in darkness again. But somehow the brief exchange had changed the quality of the silence. It felt less oppressive, more like a shared experience rather than two separate islands of isolation. Do you think we should? I started, then realized I had no idea what we should do. Walk to find a conductor? Stay put and wait? The train could be completely empty except for us, for all we knew. I'm going to guess the entire system's down, he said, seeming to follow my thoughts. Storm probably knocked out power to a section of track. We're safer staying here than wandering around in the dark. There was something reassuring about his matter-of-fact tone, like he'd been in situations like this before. Or maybe he was just better at hiding panic than I was. Makes sense, I agreed. I'm Marcus, by the way, since we might be here for a while. David. A pause, then. Nice to meet you, Marcus. Under the circumstances. I could hear him moving again, and after a moment, the soft thud of footsteps in the aisle. My chest tightened. Was he leaving? But the footsteps were coming closer, not moving away. Do you mind if I... His voice was much nearer now, maybe just a few rows away. Sitting alone in the dark is making me feel a bit like I'm in a horror film. Please, I said quickly, probably too quickly. The truth was, I'd been thinking the same thing. There's something unsettling about being alone in a powerless train car that makes every sound seem ominous. Every shadow seemed to move. I heard him settle into a seat nearby, close enough that I could sense his presence in the darkness, but not so close as to feel invasive. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside our small pocket of shared space, things felt marginally less apocalyptic. So, David said after a moment, this is probably the longest I've gone without checking my phone in about 5 years. I laughed, a real laugh this time. I was just thinking the same thing. It's weird, isn't it? Having to just sit with yourself. Maybe that's a good thing, he said, and I could hear something thoughtful in his voice. Forces us to look at each other instead. There was something in the way he said it that made my pulse quicken slightly. Not the words themselves exactly, but the tone, like he meant something more than the obvious. Of course, in the darkness, we couldn't actually see each other at all, which made the comment both ironic and strangely intimate. Where were you headed? I asked, partly to fill the silence, and partly because I genuinely wanted to know. There was something about being trapped together that made normal social boundaries feel less relevant. Edinburgh, he said. You? Same, wedding. Ah. Something in his tone suggested he had opinions about weddings, but he didn't elaborate. Family? My sister, she's I paused, realizing I was about to share more than I usually did with strangers, but the darkness made it feel safe somehow, like confessing to a priest behind a screen. She's getting married to this guy I can't stand, and the whole family's going to spend 3 days pretending it's wonderful while asking me why I'm still single. David made a sound that might have been sympathetic or amused. Sounds like a nightmare. Pretty much. What about you? Edinburgh for fun? There was a longer pause this time. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. Job interview. New start, hopefully. Something in the way he said it suggested there was more to the story. That he was running from something, rather than running towards something. But I didn't push. We'd known each other for all of 15 minutes. There were limits to how personal you could get, even in extraordinary circumstances. What kind of work? I asked instead. Architecture, commercial mostly, some residential. You? Graphic design. Freelance, which means I spend most of my time in coffee shops pretending to be productive while actually scrolling through social media. That earned me what sounded like a genuine laugh. And how's that working out for you? About as well as you'd expect. Hence the need to escape to family weddings where everyone can remind me that I'm wasting my life. The train creaked around us, settling into its temporary stillness. Outside, the storm seemed to be intensifying rather than abating, which suggested we might be here for quite a while. Strangely, I found I didn't mind the prospect as much as I should have. "Can I ask you something?" David said. "Sure. Are you actually dreading this wedding, or is it more complicated than that?" The question caught me off guard. It was perceptive in a way that suggested he'd been listening not just to my words, but to what was underneath them. "Both," I said, surprised by my own honesty. "I love my sister, but there's a lot of family history that makes these things complicated. And lately, I've been feeling like I'm disappointing everyone just by existing." "That's a heavy burden to carry," he said quietly. Something in his voice suggested he knew what that felt like. I wanted to ask, but before I could form the question, the train gave a sudden, violent lurch. Both of us were thrown sideways in our seats. In the darkness, I heard David grunt as he was slammed against something, the window or the armrest, and instinctively reached out to steady myself. My hand found his shoulder, solid and warm under his damp jacket. For a moment, neither of us moved. My palm was pressed against the curve of his shoulder, and I could feel the tension in his muscles, the way his breathing had quickened from the surprise. He was closer than I'd realized, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something subtle and woody that mixed with the lingering scent of rain in his hair. The train settled again with a metallic groan, but I didn't immediately move my hand. Neither did he pull away. We stayed like that for several heartbeats, connected by touch in the absolute darkness, and I felt something shift between us. A recognition, maybe, or an acknowledgement of something that had been building since the moment our eyes first met. "Sorry," I said finally, pulling back. When the train moved. "It's okay," he said, and his voice was rougher than before. "Are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine." "You?" "Yeah." But something had changed in the quality of the silence between us. It felt charged now, aware, like we were both holding our breath, waiting for something. "The storm's getting worse," David observed, though his voice suggested his attention was elsewhere. "Yeah," I agreed, though I was barely aware of the weather anymore. All my attention was focused on the warm space beside me, where I could sense his presence. The way his breathing had settled into a rhythm I found myself trying to match. "Marcus," he said, and then stopped. "What?" Another pause, then, "Never mind. This probably isn't the best time for..." "For what?" But before he could answer, the lights blazed back on with a fluorescent flicker that made both of us blink and shield our eyes. The sudden brightness was harsh after so long in darkness, washing out colors and making everything look stark and artificial. I turned toward David, squinting as my eyes adjusted, and found him looking directly at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. His dark eyes were wide, almost startled, as if he'd been caught in the middle of something he hadn't meant to reveal. His hair was even more disheveled than before, and there was a slight flush across his cheekbones that might have been from the sudden light or from something else entirely. We stared at each other for several seconds, neither speaking. Up close, with the lights blazing between us, I could see details I'd missed before. The small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his mouth was slightly parted, as if he'd been about to say something important. His eyes were searching my face, looking for something, permission maybe, or confirmation of whatever he thought he'd seen in the darkness. The moment stretched between us, fragile and electric. I had the distinct feeling that we were balanced on the edge of something, that whatever he'd been about to say in the darkness was still there, waiting to be spoken. Then the train lurched back to life with a mechanical roar that shattered the spell completely. The lights flickered once more, stabilized, and the familiar rhythm of wheels on tracks resumed with a jolt that threw us both back against our seats. The carriage filled with the sound of machinery waking up, air conditioning humming, electronic systems beeping back to life, the distant crackle of an intercom preparing to deliver an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your conductor speaking," a tinny voice echoed through the carriage. "We apologize for the temporary delay due to weather-related power issues. We are now back on schedule and expect to arrive in Edinburgh approximately 20 minutes behind our original timetable. Thank you for your patience." David and I looked at each other again, but the moment had passed. Whatever had been building between us in the darkness seemed to have evaporated under the harsh fluorescent lights and the return to normal service. He ran a hand through his hair, smoothing it back, and gave me a smile that was polite but guarded. Well, he said, I guess that's that. Yeah, I agreed, though part of me wanted to protest, to ask him what he'd been about to say before the lights came back on. But the moment felt too fragile, too uncertain. Maybe I'd imagined the tension between us. Maybe it had just been the strangeness of the situation, the intimacy forced by circumstance rather than choice. He stood up, straightening his jacket, and I felt a stab of disappointment that he was returning to his original seat. The spell was well and truly broken. Thanks for the company, he said, and there was something wistful in his voice that made me think maybe I hadn't imagined it after all. It would have been a much longer wait alone. Thank you too, I said, and good luck with your interview. He nodded, already stepping back into the aisle. Good luck with the wedding. I watched him walk back to his seat, noting the way his shoulders had tensed again, the careful distance he was putting between us. When he sat down, he immediately turned toward the window, effectively ending our interaction. I stared down at my book, the words still meaningless on the page, and tried to process what had just happened. Had there been something real in that moment of darkness? Or was I reading too much into a situation that had simply been strange and intense? The touch of his shoulder under my hand, the way his voice had roughened when he'd started to say my name, had that meant something, or was I projecting my own loneliness onto a perfectly innocent interaction? The train rocked gently as we picked up speed, the storm still visible through the windows, but no longer seeming to threaten our progress. In another hour, we'd be in Edinburgh, and David would disappear into his new life, while I faced 3 days of family obligation and uncomfortable questions. I found myself stealing glances at him, hoping he might turn around, make eye contact, give me some sign that I hadn't imagined the connection between us. But he remained resolutely focused on the window, and eventually I gave up trying to catch his attention. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had almost happened in those dark moments. Something that might have changed the trajectory of both our journeys, if only the lights had stayed off a little longer. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to clear, revealing patches of star-studded sky between the clouds. The rain still streaked the windows, but less violently now, and the thunder had moved on to trouble some other part of the countryside. I closed my book and leaned back in my seat, watching the landscape rush past in the darkness. In the window's reflection, I could see David's profile, still turned away from me, and I wondered what he was thinking about, whether he was relieved that the normal world had reasserted itself, or whether he felt the same sense of loss that was settling in my chest. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom again. We are now approaching Edinburgh Waverley Station. Please ensure you have all your belongings and prepare for arrival. I began gathering my things, slipping my unread book back into my bag and checking that I had my ticket. When I looked up, I saw that David was doing the same, moving with quick, efficient gestures that suggested he was eager to leave. The train began to slow, and through the windows, I could see the lights of the city approaching. Soon we'd be pulling into the station and this strange interlude would be over. David would walk off into his new life, and I would walk off into 3 days of family drama, and we'd probably never see each other again. The thought made my chest tighten with an unexpected sense of loss. As we pulled into the station, I made a decision. Whatever had or hadn't happened between us in the darkness, I couldn't let him just disappear without at least trying to understand it. Maybe I was making a fool of myself, but some things were worth the risk of embarrassment. I stood up as the train came to a complete stop and walked toward his seat. He was just shouldering his bag when I approached. David, I said. He looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in his dark eyes. Hope, maybe, or relief that I'd made the first move. Marcus, he said quietly. What were you going to say? I asked, before the lights came back on. He stared at me for several seconds, his expression unreadable. Around us, the few other passengers who had boarded at earlier stops were gathering their belongings and moving toward the exits, but we stood still in the aisle, caught in our own bubble of tension and possibility. Just as he opened his mouth to answer, the carriage lights flickered again, once, twice, and then blazed back to full brightness, as if the universe was reminding us that the moment had passed, that we were back in the real world where strangers don't bare their souls to each other after 30 minutes of conversation in the dark. David's mouth closed, and he shook his head with a rueful smile. It was nothing, he said. Just the situation, Makes you think things you wouldn't normally think. But his eyes told a different story. They were searching my face, looking for something, permission, understanding, a sign that I felt it too. I took a breath, about to respond, about to tell him that I knew exactly what he meant, that I'd been thinking the same impossible things. But before I could speak, the train doors hissed open, and a flood of Edinburgh's late-night air rushed into the carriage, carrying with it the sounds of the city and the reality of our separate destinations. The spell broke one final time. I should... David gestured toward the door, and I nodded, stepping back to let him pass. Yeah, of course. He moved toward the exit, then paused at the doorway and looked back at me. For a moment, I thought he might say something more, might bridge the gap that had opened between us with the return of the normal world. Instead, he just said, "Take care, Marcus." And then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd on the platform, leaving me standing alone in the empty carriage with the echo of his voice and the lingering scent of his cologne. I gathered my bag and followed him off the train, but by the time I reached the platform, he had vanished into the late-night crowd of Edinburgh Waverley Station. I stood there for several minutes, scanning faces and hoping to catch a glimpse of him. But it was as if the storm had swallowed him up completely. Eventually, I made my way toward the taxi rank, pulling out my phone to call my hotel. The screen blazed to life, immediately flooding with missed messages and notifications, the normal world reasserting itself with a vengeance. But as I walked through the station toward the exit, I couldn't stop thinking about those moments in the darkness, about the sound of David's voice saying my name like it meant something important, about the way his shoulder had felt under my hand, solid and warm and real, about the question he'd been about to ask me and the answer I'd been prepared to give. Outside the station, the storm had finally passed, leaving the streets of Edinburgh washed clean and gleaming under the streetlights. The air smelled of rain and possibilities, and as I climbed into a taxi and gave the driver my hotel address, I found myself wondering if this was how stories really ended, not with dramatic declarations or passionate embraces, but with two people walking away from each other into separate nights, carrying the weight of words never spoken and moments that might have changed everything. The taxi pulled away from the station, and I watched the lights recede through the rear window until they disappeared around a corner. Tomorrow, I would wake up and begin 3 days of family obligation, pretending to be someone I wasn't sure I wanted to be anymore. But tonight, for a few minutes on a powerless train in the middle of nowhere, I had been exactly who I was. And someone, a stranger with dark eyes and careful hands, had seen me clearly in the darkness and chosen to stay. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. On part 2. But as my taxi pulled away from Edinburgh Waverley Station, something made me turn back. Maybe it was the way David had looked at me in that final moment, like he was memorizing my face. Maybe it was the question that had been hanging in the air between us, unfinished and heavy with possibility. Or maybe it was simply that I couldn't bear the thought of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to stay. "Stop," I told the driver suddenly. "I need to go back." He gave me a look in the rearview mirror that suggested he'd seen plenty of late-night changes of heart. "The station? Yes, please." By the time I made it back through the terminal, rushing past the few remaining travelers and night shift workers, I was almost certain it was too late. The platform where our train had been was empty now, just wet concrete gleaming under the harsh lights. But as I stood there about catching my breath, I heard it, the distant rumble of a train that hadn't yet departed. I followed the sound, half running through the mostly empty station until I found it. Our train, still sitting at a platform on the far side of the terminal. The windows were dark except for a few scattered lights, and I could see maintenance workers moving around underneath, checking something with flashlights. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached one of the workers. "Excuse me," I said, trying not to sound as desperate as I felt. "Is this train going anywhere tonight?" The man looked up from whatever he was examining. "Delayed indefinitely, I'm afraid. Power issues caused some damage to the electrical systems. Passengers were transferred to other services or put up in hotels." He gestured toward the dark carriages. "She's not going anywhere until morning at the earliest." "Are there still people on board?" He shrugged. "Might be one or two who refused alternative transport. Some folks are stubborn about these things." I stared at the train, its windows like dark eyes in the station lighting. David could be anywhere in the city by now, settled into a hotel room, or already preparing for his morning interview. But something in my chest told me otherwise. The same instinct that had made me turn back was whispering that he might still be here, that whatever had pulled us together in the darkness might still be strong enough to keep him close. Can I started, then stopped. How do you ask a stranger to let you board a broken train to look for someone you'd talked to for 30 minutes? Is it safe to go on? I think I might have left something behind. The worker studied me for a moment, then nodded toward the nearest carriage. Doors open. Just be careful. Lighting's still patchy in places. I climbed aboard, my footsteps echoing strangely in the empty space. The carriage was dimmer than before, lit only by emergency lighting that cast long shadows between the seats. It felt different now. Not abandoned exactly, but suspended somehow, like a place outside of normal time. I walked slowly toward where David had been sitting, though I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Some sign that he'd been real, maybe, or that the connection between us hadn't been just a product of darkness and isolation. That's when I heard it. A soft sound from the far end of the carriage, the rustle of fabric, the quiet intake of breath. I turned and there he was. David sat in the same seat where I'd left him, his jacket folded beside him, his dark hair catching the emergency lighting. He was staring out the window at the empty platform. But when he heard my footsteps, he turned. Our eyes met across the length of the carriage, and I saw something flicker in his expression. Surprise, relief, recognition. He didn't seem shocked to see me, as if some part of him had been waiting. You came back, he said quietly. So did you, I replied, walking toward him. Or you never left. He smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression I'd seen from him all night. I was going to. Made it as far as the taxi queue, but then I thought about what I was about to say before the lights came back on. My pulse quickened. And I realized I didn't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to say it. I stopped a few rows away from him, close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shirt had wrinkled during our strange journey. What were you going to say? He looked at me for a long moment, as if weighing something important. I was going to ask if you believed in fate, if you thought some meetings were meant to happen. The question hung in the air between us, simple and enormous at the same time. Outside, the storm had completely cleared, leaving the platform washed clean under the station lights. Inside, we were suspended in our own pocket of possibility. I never used to, I said honestly. But tonight feels different, he finished. Yeah. He gestured to the seat across from him. The worker outside said we might be here until morning. Power damage, apparently. I sat down close enough now that I could see the small details I'd noticed in the darkness. The scar above his eyebrow, the way his fingers moved restlessly when he was thinking. But the tension between us had changed. It was still there, still electric, but softer somehow. Less desperate, more patient. I'm glad it's just us in here, David said quietly. Something warm spread through my chest at the words. Me too. We settled into a comfortable silence, the kind that feels natural rather than awkward. I found myself studying his face in the dim lighting, memorizing the angle of his jaw, the way shadows fell across his cheekbones. When I caught him doing the same to me, neither of us looked away. Can I ask you something? I said. Anything. The job interview in Edinburgh, are you running towards something or away from something? He considered this, his dark eyes thoughtful. Both, I suppose. There was a situation in London, a relationship that ended badly, a job that stopped feeling meaningful. I needed a clean start somewhere that felt far enough away to matter. Was it serious, the relationship? A shadow crossed his face. I thought it was. We were together for 3 years, living together for 2. But it turned out we wanted different things. He wanted me to be someone I wasn't sure I could be. The pronoun hung in the air between us, simple, insignificant. It was the first concrete confirmation of what I'd been sensing all night, and it sent a quiet thrill through me. Not just attraction, but recognition. What did he want you to be? I asked gently. More social, more outgoing. He said I was too serious, too closed off. He wanted someone who could charm his friends at dinner parties, who didn't need alone time to recharge. David's voice was matter of fact, but I could hear the hurt underneath. He wasn't wrong exactly. I am those things, but I couldn't figure out how to be different without losing myself completely. I nodded, understanding more than he might have expected. My ex used to say I was too much in my own head. that I thought too much about everything instead of just living. How long were you together? 2 years. It ended about 6 months ago when I finally admitted I was more in love with the idea of being in love than I was with him. I paused, surprised by my own honesty. I think I've been hiding from that ever since. Is that what you're hiding from at this wedding? The question was gentle but perceptive, and it hit closer to home than I'd expected. Partly, my family has this way of making me feel like I'm disappointing them just by existing, like I'm not living up to some version of myself they have in their heads. What version is that? Successful, settled, straight. The last word came out more bitter than I'd intended. They don't know about that last part. I keep meaning to tell them, but the timing never seems right. David leaned forward slightly, his attention focused entirely on me. That's a heavy secret to carry. It shouldn't be, should it? In 2024, it should be the most normal thing in the world. But my family, I trailed off, struggling to find the right words. They're not bad people. They're just stuck in their own ideas about what life should look like. And you're afraid they won't accept the life you actually have. I'm afraid they won't accept me, I corrected quietly. The admission hung between us, raw and honest. I'd never said it out loud before, not even to myself. But there it was. The fear that had been driving so many of my choices, keeping me isolated and careful and alone. David reached across the narrow space between our seats and touched my hand, just briefly. His fingers were warm and steady, and the contact sent electricity up my arm. For what it's worth, he said, I think you're exactly who you're supposed to be. Something cracked open in my chest at those words. Not broke, opened. Like a door I'd been keeping locked had suddenly swung wide. Thank you, I said, and meant it more than he could possibly know. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of our confessions settling between us like something precious and fragile. Outside, the platform remained empty except for the occasional maintenance worker. Inside, the emergency lighting cast everything in soft shadows that made the ordinary seats and windows feel almost magical. Are you hungry? David asked eventually, reaching for his bag. I have some things. He pulled out a small collection of items. A bottle of water, some crackers, an apple, a bar of dark chocolate that looked expensive. I always overpack food when I travel. Anxiety thing. I'd love some, I said, though I hadn't realized I was hungry until he mentioned it. He spread the food between us on the small table attached to his seat, and we began to share the impromptu meal. There was something surprisingly intimate about it, breaking pieces of chocolate and passing them back and forth, taking turns with the water bottle. The casual brush of fingers when we both reached for the crackers at the same time. This chocolate is incredible, I said, savoring a piece that tasted like coffee and sea salt. It's from this little shop near my flat in London. Was near my flat, he corrected. I bought a few bars for the journey, thinking I'd be too nervous to eat anything substantial before the interview. And now? He smiled. Now, I'm not thinking about the interview at all. Something warm curled in my stomach at the words, at the implication that I was worth more of his attention than a career opportunity he'd traveled 300 miles to pursue. We kept talking as we ate, the conversation flowing more easily now that we'd shared something real. He told me about his work, about designing buildings that tried to balance human need with environmental responsibility. I told him about my designs, about the satisfaction of creating something beautiful from nothing but ideas and pixels. Do you have any of your work with you? He asked. I pulled out my laptop, grateful for once that I never traveled anywhere without it. The battery was still good, and I opened my portfolio, angling the screen so we could both see it. This is a logo I did for a sustainable clothing company, I said, clicking through the images. And this was a complete brand identity for a bookstore cafe. David leaned closer to see better, close enough that I could smell his cologne again, that subtle woody scent that had been driving me quietly crazy all night. His shoulder brushed against mine as he pointed to one of the designs. I love this typography, he said. It's clean but warm, somehow, inviting. That's exactly what I was going for. I clicked to another project. This one was more challenging. I stopped mid-sentence, suddenly aware that we were sitting much closer than we had been before. When had that happened? Gradually, as we'd shared food and stories, and now this? David's knee was almost touching mine under the small table, and I could see the details of his face with startling clarity. The slight stubble along his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he concentrated. He seemed to realize it at the same moment I did. Our conversation faltered, and he looked up from the laptop screen to meet my eyes. We were close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath, close enough that if either of us moved just a few inches, Marcus, he said quietly, and my name sounded different in his voice now. Softer, more intimate. Yeah? If this train never started again, would you be okay with that? The question sent a shiver through me, not of cold, but of recognition. Because the truth was, I didn't want the train to move again. I didn't want this strange, suspended moment to end. I didn't want to return to the world where we were strangers heading to different destinations, different lives. Yes, I said, and the honesty of it surprised me. I think I would. Something shifted in his expression, became more focused, more intent. Even though you'd miss the wedding, even though I'd miss my interview, I thought about it seriously because the question deserved a serious answer. Miss Emma's wedding, disappoint my family, let down my sister on the most important day of her life? A day ago, the idea would have been unthinkable. But sitting here in the dim light, sharing chocolate and confessions with someone who saw me clearly without judgment, I know that makes me terrible, I said slowly, but yes. I'd rather be here with you than anywhere else I'm supposed to be. The words hung in the air between us, more intimate than anything we'd shared yet. David's eyes darkened, and I watched his gaze flicker briefly to my mouth before meeting my eyes again. It doesn't make you terrible, he said. It makes you honest. The space between us seemed to shrink without either of us moving. I was acutely aware of everything, the sound of our breathing, the way the emergency lighting caught in his dark hair, the fact that his hand was resting on the table mere inches from mine. It wasn't the train that had trapped me, I realized. It was his ease. The way they looked at me like I was someone worth seeing, worth staying for, worth choosing, over all the practical considerations that usually governed my life. David, I started, not sure what I was going to say. I know, he said quietly. I feel it too. The acknowledgement hung between us like a bridge, an invitation to step into something that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, could see the pulse beating in the hollow of his throat. Slowly, carefully, he moved his hand across the small table until his fingers touched mine. The contact was light, questioning, giving me every opportunity to pull away. Instead, I turned my hand palm up and let our fingers intertwine. The touch was electric, sending warmth shooting up my arm and settling somewhere deep in my chest. His fingers were long and warm, slightly rough from work, and they fit against mine like we'd been holding hands for years instead of hours. Is this crazy? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Probably, he said, smiling. But I stopped caring about crazy about 2 hours ago. We sat like that for a long time, hands linked across the table, looking at each other in the dim light. And it should have been awkward. We were still essentially strangers after all. But it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Like we'd been building toward this moment since the train first ground to a halt. Tell me something else, David said eventually. Something you've never told anyone. The request was intimate, trusting, and I found myself wanting to give him whatever he asked for. I used to write poetry, I said, in college and for a few years after. I was actually pretty good at it. Used to, what happened? Life, I suppose. It felt too vulnerable, too revealing, easier to hide behind other people's brands than to put my own words out into the world. I paused, surprised by how much that admission hurt to say out loud. I haven't written anything in almost 5 years. Do you miss it? Every day, I said, and realized it was true. What about you? What's your secret? He was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing small circles across the back of my hand. The simple touch was hypnotic, soothing and arousing at the same time. I'm scared, he said finally, of the interview, of starting over, of failing at something new. But mostly I'm scared that I'll never feel about anyone the way I'm starting to feel about you. The confession hit me like a physical force, stealing my breath and making my heart race. The honesty of it, the vulnerability, the implication that this thing between us was as real for him as it was becoming for me. How are you starting to feel about me? I asked, though I wasn't sure I was brave enough to hear the answer. He looked at our joined hands, then back at my face, and like maybe I was supposed to be on this train tonight. Like maybe everything that went wrong in London was just leading me here, to this moment, to you. I felt something crack open even wider in my chest, letting in light and warmth and possibility. David, I know it's crazy, he said quickly. We've known each other for a few hours. This could just be the situation, the isolation, the strangeness of it all. It's not, I interrupted, surprising myself with my certainty. I mean, maybe it is for you, but for me, this feels like the most real thing that's happened to me in years. His eyes widened slightly, hope and something deeper flickering in their depths. Really? Really? I squeezed his fingers, anchoring us both to the moment. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for this to stop feeling so right, but it just doesn't. Outside, I could hear the distant sounds of the city settling into the deep hours of the night. Inside our small cocoon of light and warmth, time seemed to have slowed to match our breathing, our heartbeats, the gentle rhythm of our thumbs stroking across each other's hands. What happens now? David asked softly. It was the question I'd been avoiding, the one that would force us to acknowledge that this couldn't last forever. Eventually, the train would be repaired. Eventually, we'd have to return to our separate lives, our separate destinations. I don't know, I said honestly, but I don't want to think about it yet. Neither do I. We lapsed into comfortable silence again, the kind that felt full rather than empty. I found myself memorizing details, the way the dim light cast shadows across his face, the steady pressure of his fingers against mine, the sound of rain that had started again outside, lighter now but persistent. It's getting late, David observed, though he made no move to let go of my hand. Early, I corrected, noting the way the darkness outside was beginning to soften at the edges. It'll be dawn soon. The reality of that hit both of us at the same time. Dawn meant morning. Morning meant the maintenance crew would finish their work, the train would return to service, and this suspended moment would end. I should probably try to get some sleep, David said, though his voice suggested he had no intention of doing so. Probably, I agreed, equally unconvincing. Instead, we stayed exactly where we were, hands linked, eyes meeting and holding in the dim light. The approaching dawn felt both inevitable and impossible. How could the night end, when it felt like it had barely begun? Marcus, David said, and something in his voice made my pulse quicken. Yeah? When we get to Edinburgh, when this is all over, I don't want to lose this, whatever this is. The words sent relief flooding through me so intense it was almost dizzying. You won't, I said. I mean, if you don't want to, you won't. Even though you have a wedding to go to and I have a job interview and we live 300 miles apart? Especially because of that, I said, surprised by my own conviction. David, I haven't felt this way about anyone in maybe ever. I'm not going to let geography or bad timing or my family's expectations talk me out of it. Something bright and warm flared in his eyes. Are you sure? I'm sure. And I was, with a certainty that felt both new and ancient, like something I'd been waiting my whole life to feel. Are you? I've never been more sure of anything. The declaration hung between us like a promise, solid and real in a way that made everything else feel possible. We could figure out the logistics later, the distance, the complications, the practical realities of building something between two lives that had barely intersected. Right now, it was enough to know that we both wanted to try. Outside, the sky was definitely getting lighter, the deep black of night giving way to the deep gray of pre-dawn. I could hear more activity on the platform, voices, the sound of equipment being moved. The real world was waking up, preparing to reclaim us. They'll probably have the train running soon, David said, voicing what we were both thinking. Probably. But neither of us moved, neither of us let go. If these were our last few minutes suspended outside of normal time, we were going to hold on to them as long as possible. That's when we heard it. The deep rumble of an engine coming back to life. The mechanical sounds of a train preparing to move again. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied into full brightness that made us both blink and squint. Ladies and gentlemen, the conductor's voice crackled over the intercom. We are pleased to announce that repairs have been completed, and we will be departing for Edinburgh Waverley Station shortly. We apologize once again for the extended delay, and thank you for your patience. David and I looked at each other, still holding hands across the small table, and I saw my own mix of anticipation and regret reflected in his eyes. The night was ending, but something else was beginning. Well, he said softly, I guess this is it. No, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. This isn't ending anything. This is just the next part. He smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. The next part. The train gave a gentle lurch as it began to move, and we both swayed slightly in our seats. Our hands separated as we reached out to steady ourselves, but the loss of contact felt temporary rather than final. As Edinburgh came into view through the windows, first the outskirts, then the familiar landmarks, then the approach to Waverley Station, I felt something settling into place in my chest. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a loss, but a discovery. The train began to slow as we approached the platform, and David gathered his bag, checking to make sure he had everything. I did the same, though part of me wanted to sit still and refuse to leave, to somehow extend this strange and perfect night indefinitely. Marcus, David said as the train came to a complete stop. Yeah? He moved closer, close enough that I could see the exhaustion and exhilaration in his eyes. The way the early morning light caught the stubble along his jaw, close enough that when he leaned in, I could feel the warmth of his breath against my ear. Maybe this doesn't have to end here, he whispered. The words sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with possibility. I turned to meet his eyes, seeing hope and want and something deeper reflected in their dark depths. No, I said quietly. It doesn't. The train doors hissed open and the sounds of Edinburgh Waverley Station flooded in. Announcements, footsteps, the bustle of a city waking up. But in our small pocket of space, everything was quiet and charged and full of potential. David smiled, slow and warm and genuine, and for the first time since I'd boarded the train 12 hours earlier, I felt like I knew exactly where I was going.